There are two ways to create a sub directly within the code window. Well, there are three ways actually. You can always copy and paste in code from anywhere else, such as like this, but let's only consider the ways to build code from scratch. The first is via the prompt dialog box. Go to the Insert tab, click on Procedure, get the dialog box Add Procedure. Let's provide a name for our sub, and by sub, I essentially mean a macro. The naming rules are as follows: no spaces, start with a letter, can otherwise contain letters, numbers, and certain special characters such as an underscore, a maximum length of 255 characters, and avoid using names already in use in VBA such as sub, function, public, etc. And a suggestion would be to use meaningful names. I'm going to go with the name greet user. For naming subs, I use Pascal case, which is where the first letter for every word in the name is capital. In the type, we want to create a sub procedure, so the type will be sub. The scope doesn't matter for this exercise. We will go with public, and we'll leave the checkbox for local variables unchecked. Press OK, and the template for the sub procedure is automatically created for us. There are two lines of code. The keyword sub in the first line of code declares the start of the sub procedure, and the last line, which has the end keyword, signifies the end of the sub procedure. Any instruction or other code needs to be entered between these two lines. The keyword public denotes that the scope of a procedure is public. That means we can call this sub from any sub in any other module. This is a concept that we'll cover in a later lesson, but for practical purposes, a public sub can be assigned to run on a click of a form button from the Excel sheet. A private sub can't. By default, all subs are public unless specified, and we don't need to explicitly write the public keyword. So let's delete it. And we have an open and close parenthesis after the sub name. This denotes that we're not passing any arguments through this sub, or rather, we're not specifying further options to customize the execution of a macro. If we were, we would enter those option names or arguments within these round brackets. Okay, that was one way of creating a sub manually. Let's look at another way. So we will just delete off this previous text. Now we know that a sub procedure must begin with the keyword sub. So let's type in sub space, and let's type in the procedure name. And now we don't need to type anything further. Just press enter. Two extra pieces of code have been added: the open and close parenthesis and the end sub line at the end have been automatically added by VBA. This is a more convenient way to write subs, and we'll follow this method going forward. And if you ever happen to forget the syntax for writing a sub, you could just type the word sub, click on it, and hit F1 on your keyboard. And we are taken to the Microsoft Learn page, which will give you the details for the correct syntax. This tip obviously assumes that we have internet connection, and this help system works on any VBA keyword or method name. Let's jump slightly ahead and type in the word message box for the message box function. And let's click F1. And we come to its help page. Delete. Next, let's type in our code. First, let's display a message in a pop-up dialog box. We will use the message box function. We will place our cursor on a line between the sub and the end sub line. And if you can't see any free lines, just press enter after the close round bracket to create a new line. Click anywhere on the line. The cursor will be at the start of the line, aligned with the starting characters of the words sub and end. Now let's press tab on your keyboard to add an indent or a fixed length of space. Indenting is a recommended practice and not a VBA rule. We'll talk more about it shortly in this video. We can now enter our code. Let's enter the function name message box. Press space. We see a screen tip showing the function definition with any parameter info. And if you don't see this help text, you can press the shortcut key Ctrl-I. Text is just telling us what arguments need to go within this function. Only the prompt argument is compulsory, which is basically the text that we want to display. In VBA, text is called as string or a string literal. A string literal needs to be entered within double quotes. So let's put in two double quotes, place our cursor in between them, and let's type out our text. Hello, comma ash, and click away. Actually, move a cursor outside of the double quotes to the end of the line. Each instruction or line of code in VBA is called a statement. There are different types of statements which we'll learn about in a later lesson. So let's write our next line of code. It will be to print out another message in the immediate window down below. Our cursor is at the end of the first line of code. Press enter. Notice where our cursor is. It is at the same indent level of the previous line. Now we'll use the debug.print statement to print our message in the immediate window. Print is a method or a function that is made available by the debug object. We will cover object and methods in a later lesson. For now, let's just type in the word debug. Press dot. The moment we type dot, we get a list. This is VBA's version of autofill known as IntelliSense. This list shows us all the members that are available within the debug object. On a high level, these members give us access to various features, and the feature that we are after is the ability to print a message within the immediate window, which will be the print method. And if this list disappears, you can always press Ctrl space after the dot to make it appear again. Let's start typing in the word print. Let's type in P first. The print option is selected. We can either click on this option or press Tab to accept the selection. Press space. We will again enter some text. We'll just say that the user was greeted, and that's our macro. Before we run the macro though, let's examine the structure further. First, let's complete a discussion on indents. Indenting is not a requirement, it's just good coding practice. Indents make our code more readable. Having each line of code one below the other within the same indent makes the code look monotonous and affects readability of larger blocks of code. For now, we can add an indent to our code statements to separate them visibly from the sub and end sub statements. We will check out an if statement logic shortly where we'll add even further indents. And the guideline is that code within the same logic block should be on the same indent level. We can even add indents to the entire block of code by just selecting it and pressing the indent button on the edit toolbar, or just press the tab key. And we can even remove an indent by selecting the block of code and pressing the outdent button or shift tab on our keyboard. Next, let's look at capitalization of keywords. VBA keywords are auto-capitalized. So suppose we type in the word sub in all lowercase and click away, VBA will capitalize it for us. VBA also auto-adjusts to one white space after every word. Let's remove the space after message box and click away. The space gets added back. Let's add more white spaces, click away, and it gets adjusted back. And the spacing rule does not apply to any words within double quotations. And VBA also follows a color scheme to highlight various elements of the code. So keywords such as sub, debug, print, end are in blue. Identifiers such as function names, sub-procedure names are in black. The text that we type in is in black as well. This is the default color schema which can be changed by going into the options setting, but I would recommend leaving the default options as is. If you make a mistake, it gets highlighted in red. So let's misspell the word print and click away. The entire line of code gets highlighted in red. This is a syntax error, indicating that there is something wrong with this line of code. The macro will not run unless we fix this error. Ctrl Z to undo. And the color green is for comments. Comments are line of text that are ignored by the macro. They are only for our reference, and we can add in a comment by adding an apostrophe and then the text. So let's press enter, tab, and apostrophe, and add in a comment that tells us what the next line of code is about to do. Click away. The line turns green. We can use comments to add some notes regarding the logic that we have used. They're very useful to refer back to, especially when you've been away from your macro for a really long time. But I would reserve comments for more complex logic than what we have mentioned out here. And we can even have comments outside the sub showing version notes. We can even comment multiple lines in one go. So select the block of code that you want to comment, go to the edit toolbar and click on the comment block button. And both lines of code have been commented out. And to undo it, we can click on the uncomment block. Next, let's look at the execution order of our code. VBA executes code one line at a time. We have two instructions, each on a separate line. We could even include both statements on the same line separated by a colon. So like this, but it's best practice to have one instruction per line. And we can have spaces between lines as well. That won't matter. As long as the code sits between the sub and end sub statements, it will run. And lastly, we can have multiple subs within the same module. So let's just copy and paste the code. We can't have subs with the same name. So let's rename it. So now we have two subs in our current module. Similarly, we can have another module with more subs in it and so on. Okay, so far we've talked about the structure of code. Next, let's execute this greet user procedure. So keep our cursor within the sub, that is, click once inside the sub, head up to the standard toolbar, and hit the green play button. The message is displayed in a dialog box in Excel, and the confirmation message is printed out in the immediate window. The message box message was for the user, and the debug.print message was for us, the programmer. We use the immediate window to verify values or actions while building code, but in our final code, we will need to remove any debug.print statements as they won't add any value. So let's clear the immediate window, select the text, delete, and we could also use the shortcut key F5 to run the macro. And when we run a macro, every statement of code gets executed one after the other in a sequence. We could run the code one line at a time as well. This is done by stepping through the code. So let's keep our cursor within the sub procedure, press F8 on our keyboard. The first sub statement gets highlighted with a yellow bar. We have now entered break mode, and we can confirm this by looking at the top bar. We can see the word break after our file name. Press F8 again. The yellow bar moves to the message box line. It indicates that the message box statement is the next line of code to be executed. Press F8 again. We get the message box, click OK. We are now at the debug.print line. Press F8 again. The message is printed out. Press F8 and we exit the macro. We are going to start writing meaningful code a few chapters down the line. Theoretically, we need to understand the VBA code structure and the rules for interacting with Excel first. But since we already have the code window open, let's write and execute different variations of basic code as a fun experiment. Any concepts mentioned now will be discussed in detail in future lessons. Okay, so I'm just going to delete these two lines in our first sub procedure, make some space out here, dive into our code. First, let's go to sheet 1 in the Excel workbook. I've placed my name in cell A2. We can go back to the VB editor, Alt F11. So for the first part, let's grab the name directly from cell A2 in sheet 1. To grab a value from a cell, we first need to identify the cell by referring to the sheet it's in. So the sheet it's in is, and remember, this is the worksheet code name that we had added earlier against sheet 1. And within this sheet, we want to refer to cell A1, which is, press a dot, go to the range, cell A1. And now let's read its value property, which is dot value. And we can display this value directly inside a message box. So let's add the message box function in front. Actually, let's comment this out. Before we attempt to display this value directly in our code, we can first print it out in the immediate window. So let's do that. Copy, use the debug.print command and print out the value in cell A1. Let's run this code, F5. We've grabbed the value username and not my name, which means we are referring to the wrong cell. And we need to update our cell reference. So let's try this out. Delete the values in the immediate window, hit F5, and we're grabbing the right value now. This is a more appropriate way of using the debug.print statement. Okay, now that we know that we are grabbing the right value, let's remove the comment against the message box statement, update the cell reference, and run the macro. The name gets displayed, click OK. So that worked. But instead of passing this name directly into the message box function, we can first read and store its value in a temporary location. This temporary location is called a variable. So let's make some space. In fact, let's delete this line. The intention behind this part of the lesson is just to give you a look and feel of how we would write code within a code window. So I'm trying to move through the macro and write code organically. If you don't follow the syntax at this moment, that's fine. We will cover it in future lessons. So we were going to put this value inside a temporary location, which is called a variable. First, we need to tell or declare to VBA that we want to create a variable that will hold a text value, which is also known as a string. So declare, which is the dim keyword, provide our variable name. I'm putting a suffix str for string, and this variable is going to have a string data type. And let's read the value from the cell and assign it to this variable. So I'm just going to copy this variable name. To copy any word quickly, I just double click on it, then do Control C on my keyboard and then Control V in the place I want to place it. And we're going to assign the value from our cell into the variable. And now we can refer directly to the variable name in the message box function. And notice we are not putting any double quotes around the variable name. We only put double quotes around actual or literal string values. Great. Let's run this code. The name gets displayed. Next, let's join our greeting, which is hello, to our variable, which is my name Ash. And we can join these two text values using the ampersand symbol. So after hello, I'm going to put a comma and a space and close the double quotes. And to join the variable name, we need to put in the ampersand symbol followed by a space. Click away. That looks good. Let's run this code. Next, what if there was no cell value in cell A2? In that case, we could assign a default value user to this variable. This is basically the same as an if logic in Excel. So if the value in this variable is blank, then we'll assign the value user to this variable. Again, don't worry about the syntax. So if, and we need the variable name, I could either copy it or start typing the name and use the autofill option control space. Type in N, I can see the variable name below, tab to accept it. So if this value is blank, then, and in VBA, just like we have the end sub statement to signify the end of a sub procedure, we need to add an end if statement to signify the end of an if statement. So we'll add the words end if at the bottom. Oh, this message box logic needs to be outside the if statement. So let's cut and paste it below. Okay, we need to add a logic now within the if statement. So remember our discussion on indents. Code within the same logic block needs to be on the same indent. This if statement is a new logic block within the outer sub block. Hence, any logic within the if statement will carry an extra indent. So add an indent, and if this variable is blank, then we'll feed in the value user to it. Okay, so here's the logic quickly. Grab the value from cell A2. If the value is blank, we'll add a default value user to the variable name, and we'll display the text hello along with the variable name, and then debug.print the confirmation statement. Okay, we need to remove the value from cell A2, delete, go back to our macro, and we can run this macro now. Hit the play button, and we get a text hello user. Okay, and that's it. I'll repeat this once again. If this code seems a bit overwhelming at this stage, don't worry. Each of the future lessons in this course will progressively build your foundation in VBA. We will cover the concepts of variables and if statements in great detail in chapter 3. However, you could always try and practice to read values from a single cell and display them. We can even write single lines of code directly into the ImageIt window. To read a property or a value from an object such as a cell, we need to first type a question mark and then add in the code. So we could just add in this code. So basically we're trying to read the value from the cell A2. Let's first go back and add in a value. Go back to our code and press enter, and we get the value. If you want to execute a function or assign a value, we could just directly type in the code. So what we could do is remove the question mark and display the value in the cell directly, press enter, and we get a message box. So similar to the debug.print statement, writing directly into the immediate code is useful when we are debugging our code and we want to cross-check single lines of code. Now this code window is directly connected to our module that has been selected out here. But if you double click on, say, the this workbook object, we bring up a code window associated with the workbook object module. So can we use these code windows for writing VBA code as well? The answer is yes. However, code windows associated with Excel objects usually have code that is related to a particular action, or rather an event against that object. So suppose we want to display a message whenever we click on sheet 1. We could double click on the sheet 1 module and add our code in here. But for that, we need to come to the first drop-down box called the object box and select the worksheet. We see a default procedure has been created for us. This is an event procedure, but it's not the one that we are after. We can access other events associated with the worksheet object by coming to the second drop-down box called the procedure box and click on the activate event. So this is the procedure that we are after. We can just delete the other one off, tab in, and we will display a message saying that you are on sheet 1. Okay. Now let's come back to our Excel workbook. In order to run that macro, we need to click out onto a different sheet. So let's click on sheet 2. And now let's click back on sheet 1. And we get our message. We will explore events in a later lesson. There will be times when our macro execution is taking just too long to complete. There are several reasons for this. Either the logic that we have written is simply too slow, or maybe we are stuck in an infinite loop where the code might keep repeating itself without any instruction to quit. So if that happens, one way to pause the execution would be to use the shortcut keys Ctrl plus pause break on the keyboard. We could even come to the standard toolbar and press the pause or the reset button. But many a times the VBA editor is not responsive during macro execution. So let's try this out. I'm going to create a new module and paste in some code there. Right click, insert module, and I'm just going to directly paste in some code. Don't worry about the syntax for this. All we are doing out here is populating the value 1 into each cell across 100,000 rows and 100 columns. This macro is deliberately designed to take some time to complete. Let's run it. So the macro is running and the pause and the reset button are not responsive. So let's press Ctrl pause break on the keyboard. Sometimes the escape key works as well, and we get a message saying that the code execution was interrupted. We can either choose to continue the execution or end or debug. End will terminate the execution and debug will take us into the code, or rather step into the code. So press debug. And just for your information, the macro is actually running. It's just running really slowly. We are at row 12,000 something and on the 11th column, and it's just taking its while to complete. So either we can press the play button to continue executing or the stop button to exit. Let's press stop. And a word of caution, Excel can always hang and crash. It is always advisable to ensure that the macro file is saved before we execute any macro. And that concludes this section on writing code. Let's return to the VBA editor and check out what customization options are available to us.